My name is David Broockman. I'm an associate professor of political science here in the Department of Political Science at UC Berkeley. I'm also, I believe, the incoming faculty director of the Citrin Center next year. So let me first introduce a little bit about the Citrin Center before I talk about our distinguished honoree today. So the Citrin Center was created in 2017 through donations from friends, family, colleagues, and former students to honor the career and legacy of Professor Jack Citrin's 47 years on the faculty here. And the center does a variety of things. It conducts polling, it engages in cutting edge research, it sponsors faculty research, student research, organizes conferences, and organizes events like today's. And that brings me to today's event. So today we have an award we give out at the Citrin Center every year called the Citrin Award, which recognizes the career of an individual who has made significant contributions to the study and understanding of public opinion. And when you hear the description of that award, it's hard to come up with any other name first in mind than Professor Don Green, who is the John William Burgess Professor in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University. He previously, for many years, from 1989 to 2011, was a professor at Yale. He was also the director of the Yale Institution for Social and Policy Studies for many years as well. I'll just say a little bit before I turn it over to Don about Don's contribution, why I think we're also excited to give him this award. I think it's easy to see Don's contributions by the numbers. He's the author of 5 books, over 100 articles on just topics: partisanship, hate crimes, voter turnout, research methods, campaigns. But just to give you one sense, so I'm currently of the magnitude and the importance of Don's contributions. I'm currently teaching a PhD course. Some of the students in that course are here right now on political behavior. And I would say you can't go through a single week of that course without seeing the influence of Don Green's ideas, either in articles that are assigned or in thinking through how the articles that are assigned wouldn't even have been written if Professor Green hadn't written what he had done and had the influence that he had. So as I was saying to the students in class like a couple weeks ago, if you look at public opinion research in the 1970s or the 80s, I think it's no exaggeration to say that it is just full of approaches that Professor Green's career kind of turned the direction of, be it the dominance of rational choice theory, people not thinking seriously about issues related to measurement error, not careful causal inference, a lack of experiments. And I think Professor Green's just dogged and rigorous pursuit of trying to get the right answer to questions, trying to think theoretically and clearly, just shows itself in kind of all of these topics that we study in American political behavior. The last thing that I would be remiss not to mention before I turn it over to Don would just be to mention briefly Don's many connections to our department. So first of all, Don was actually my undergrad advisor when I was in college, and I would say the single biggest reason that I ended up coming into this career. When I was in college, I took his class freshman year, and that kind of set me on the path that I'm on. But likewise, Don also got his PhD here. Jack Citrin was one of his advisors. He was also advised, I believe, by Meryl Shanks, who's here. And Don's students include both me as well as Eric Schickler, Terry on our faculty, Pia, who's one of our PhD students, and he's also been colleagues with in the past with other people in this department, including Thad Dunning and Susan Hyde. So Don's connections to this department are very deep, and so for so many reasons, we are so pleased to have him here. And with that, I will turn it over to our awardee, Professor Don Green.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Let's see, I'm hoping that you can hear me okay with my little mic. It's of course very flattering to get that kind of introduction from anybody, but especially a scholar of David Brockman's caliber. So thank you. It's very flattering, especially to get an award called the Citrin Award, because I know from firsthand experience what an outstanding instructor Jack is, what an outstanding mentor, advisor, co-author, friend. So it's just a pleasure all around. When Gabe Lenz informed me that I was the recipient of this award, he invited me to give an address on any topic of my choosing. And I thought, rather than give a kind of self-referential valedictory address on my own topic, I would use this as an occasion to do the unfinished business of Jack's public opinion class, the very first such class that I took when I first came to Berkeley in 1983. hard to believe that 40 years have passed, but in that class, other students were interested in the media effects literature, but I wasn't really so interested in that. I was more interested in other things, the things that I wrote my dissertation on, having to do with self-interest and its effects on public opinion and political behavior. So I kind of let the media literature slide. But now, in the last 5-10 years, I've become increasingly interested in the media literature. So I decided that I was going to make my winter breaks project, reading a big stack of books and articles on propaganda. And so I'm all charged up to give you a book report on what I've learned from that. And there's even a little reference, actually a couple slides worth of references at the end, and that barely scratches the surface. So if anybody wants my Dropbox full of marked up PDFs, they are welcome to them. I know that the time is going to be kind of tight, given that I've way over prepared my my talk. So I can't regale you with Jack Citrin stories now, but maybe we can come back to that at the end. So we'll save that for the Q&A part. There you go. Take the award then. Take it back. Okay, so the first thing I'll cover in this outline is what counts as propaganda, some theories about the channels through which propaganda might be influential, in terms of the kinds of things that propagandists often care about, like changing beliefs or attitudes or motivation to fight in wars. We'll focus on a bit of the competing, we won't go overboard in this, but the competing psychological theories. Because part of the reason this is so intriguing to me way back in 1983 is that, as a fresh-faced 22-year-old that didn't know anything about anything, I thought, oh, of course the media is influential. Yet I was disabused of this notion by people like Jack and Merrill and others who said, well, actually, the survey researchers of that era were very skeptical that media was influential. In fact, their early findings said no. So part of what I wanted to do in doing this reading from basically the 1930s to the present was to retrace the thinking of the critics of propaganda, those who were skeptical of it, and the proponents of propaganda's influence. So we're going to see both sides. And then, and this is maybe the bulk of the talk, we're going to get down to the evidence. And in particular, sort of reflecting my own sort of prejudices, we're going to focus on the experimental literature, primarily the survey experimental literature, the field experimental literature, and then the kind of quasi-experimental literature, and with apologies to people like Thad. So then there's going to be a little bit of a twist, and we'll save that for you at the end in the summary. Okay, so what is propaganda? Basically, although social scientists were very interested in this topic in the 1930s and 40s, the term propaganda basically fell out of use for a long time for all the obvious reasons, because it was very difficult to come up with a rigorous definition of what differentiated propaganda from just advocacy communication. But it's still widely used in journalism. Oh, is it used in journalism, and especially by our friends at the New York Times, who interestingly don't use it very much in connection with American communication. But anyway, that's their choice. So at any rate, the point that I want to make is when I went back to the literature from the 1930s, people like, well, everybody. I mean, everybody was opining about how the United States was sort of losing the race to propagandize. And in particular, they focused on the Reich's Ministry of Public Enlightenment, for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, headed by Joseph Goebbels, okay? And the idea was that just as in World War I, where the Brits thought that they had an advantage, and indeed the Nazis thought that the British had the advantage in World War I, the Americans thought we better get to it. We better either figure out how to manufacture such propaganda on our own, or we better figure out how to diffuse German and Soviet and other kinds of propaganda. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that it sort of circumvents this whole question of can you code a specific piece of communication as propaganda or not, and gets back to the essentials of it, which was this was about institutions and whether the output of those institutions could be influential. And perhaps the operative thinking there, and I think this is an important idea, is that the thing that differentiates propaganda making from just mere advocacy is that propaganda never takes a day off, right? It's not as though Goebbels, occasionally said, "Well, you got me." No. It was a completely unrelenting barrage of propaganda for his 12 years. And I think that idea is an important one. And the evidence that I'm going to review is going to analyze not only the effects of unrelenting propaganda, but also what happens when you puncture the monopoly of communication. So we'll talk about that. So the question here is whether the communications that come out of the propaganda machine are influential. Now, there are a lot of different ways that propaganda could be influential, even if it were not persuasive. And I just want to draw that distinction, that things could be influential for reasons that have nothing to do with whether they persuade people, although they could persuade people. And the arguments that you see in, Mein Kampf in chapter 6 are all about, making the arguments simple, never making them two-sided, repeating them doggedly, and so on and so forth, and calling out, basically extracting emotional reactions. So these are the persuasive arguments. But the other argument, especially the ones that have been the focus of political science scholarship recently, focus on the notion that, well, propaganda is just a signal. It's a way for government to say things that might be so ludicrous that they basically are litmus tests for elites who are either going to be cowed into submission and are going to have to sign on to ludicrous claims, or they're going to be outed as people who can't do such things, and they're potential enemies of the state, the party, whatever it may be. And so a lot of the theories about propaganda are basically about how it doesn't persuade, but rather it's really about dominant elite discourse. Now, to the extent that there's a kind of persuasive side of it, you might say that the move toward so-called soft propaganda, especially by by the Chinese, is basically the idea that you're going to insinuate it in narrative stories. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry now to put high production value propaganda into popular movies to rev up Chinese, as you'll see from some of the experiments that I'll discuss later, against the Japanese or against the West. So that's a persuasive move, but it's kind of it's not the overt old-fashioned propaganda that says that Kim Jong-un was born with a halo hovering over his head for the first 2 hours of his life, things like that. Okay. Then there's another theory, kind of residual theory that should be lost sight of, and we'll come back to it a little bit empirically. This idea that, okay, it's not about persuading anybody, but it is about bucking up the morale of the regime's supporters and making sure that they don't have any taste for dissenting views. All right, so the core hypothesis among those who believe it's persuasive is basically about exposure changing beliefs, norms, attitudes, tastes, motivations. And the subsidiary hypothesis, which is very important, is that this kind of effect is especially important when the state or the party or the religion or whatever it may be is able to monopolize communication. All right, so what might be some theories for and against? Well, John's here, so it's good that one of his theories is going to put in an appearance. And this is the idea of a kind of mainstream consensus generating a perception of social norms. So right-thinking people are going to defer to the dominant narrative about how events are unfolding, or who's to blame, or why there's a war, or a police action, or a special operation, or what we're going to call it. So that idea is one of the most important ideas behind the notion that propaganda could be effective. And a friendly cousin to that is the work associated with Albert Bandura about modeling appropriate behavior. So to the extent that these narratives are meant to scare off opponents or to basically lure in potential adherents, it's all about basically a morality play where the supporters of the regime are going to be rewarded and the opponents are going to be punished. So it's again sort of it's not literally engaging in coercion, but it's certainly modeling rewards and benefits. Another theory that seems to militate in favor of the effectiveness of propaganda is the ever popular elaboration likelihood model, which says that you let down your guard when there are these patriotic themes, with patriotic music, and you're lured into these kinds of views as a result of your long-standing orientations. And then again, the idea of repetition and cognitive accessibility, people like Fazio, argue that just in general, repetition tends to be effective, especially among people who don't think particularly in a particularly sophisticated way about politics, which from Jack's course we know to be a lot of people. So then the skeptics say, well, that may be so, but one of the interesting things about persuasive communication is that it tends to dissipate unless it is continually reinforced. So to the extent that effects decay, people might be charged up when they're in the movie theater, but will they be charged up a week later is an open question. Another argument associated with Kershaw's essay on propaganda in Nazi Germany is that you can get people riled up about the goals of the state, who the enemies of the state are, basic beliefs about who's to blame or what's causing what, but you can't change people's views about how things are going, or at least not for very long. So the argument is that it was fine, all well and good when the German propagandists were telling the Germans about the goals of the war as it broke out, but once it came time to explain why it was that their loved ones were not coming home after the Battle of Stalingrad, they could not sustain it forever, because the Germans were told that they won Stalingrad, okay, and that they were encircling the opponent and that they had captured hundreds of thousands of Russians. Actually, the opposite was true, and it wasn't known in September of 1942 when the battle ended, but it eventually they figured it out by February of 1943. So that's a kind of interesting argument, because there's going to be this other argument that I probably don't have time to do justice to, which is this informational autocrat argument, the Guriev and Treisman argument, which is basically that there's been a secular change among autocratic, strategies over time, and they're getting less likely to kill, less likely to torture, less likely to basically bust heads, and more likely to monopolize information technology and essentially root out their elite opponents while not engaging in overt violence. Instead, they're going to be presenting themselves as competent, okay? So to the extent that they're running implicitly in sham elections on a competence agenda, the question of whether propaganda can change people's views about how things are going becomes rather crucial. Okay, then there's this issue. Apparently the SS was taking attendance in movie theaters, and so when they released movies like The Eternal Jew, they were very disappointed that not more people were going. And it just in general, the SS was disappointed in German participation, and part of the reason is that the complaint was everything that they say is predictable and boring, and who cares? And so if you're not sustaining the messaging, you could end up losing the effect of propaganda, or at least that's the argument. All right, so now we're going to look at the evidence. We're going to buzz through it rather quickly. Just to kind of give you the lay of the land. First, we're going to look at so-called natural experiments, and these are observational studies. They're not experiments, despite the name. In fact, to quote my longstanding colleague, co-author, friend, Alan Gerber, his dictum is that a natural experiment is an observational study whose flaws are not immediately apparent. Okay, that kind of consideration should be in our heads at all times. And the move that all of these studies are going to be doing, and by the way, they're done by some very, very talented and capable microeconomists, applied micro people. They're going to be looking at variations in reception of signals, radio signals, in some cases, TV signals in other cases, and they're going to look at variations that are brought about by topographical causes, or in some cases, even sunspots. And the idea is that as if random variations are going to cause behaviors as a result of reception of propaganda in some places and not in others. Okay, but that's going to be the focus. And then we're going to look at either some cases where the propaganda is going to be doing the treating, and some cases where the independent voices are going to be doing the interrupting. to get at both sides of these hypotheses. All right, so to start our forced march through the literature, we're going to start chronologically with one of the most interesting studies by Adina et al. So this is a study that looks at transmission of radio in Weimar, Germany, and then the transition into Nazi Germany. So what's going to happen is they're going to look at a series of elections leading up to Hitler's ascension to the chancellorship, I think in January 31st, 1933. There's going to be a 5-week-long election period before the March 5th election in 1933 that's basically going to seal him as the victor. But because he's in control of the police and he's in control of the radio, that radio campaign is basically a Hitler campaign, and very few other people get any airtime at all. So the cool thing about this study, the reason it's so memorable and interesting, is that they're going to find that the Weimar anti-Hitler messages leading up to 1933 are associated with negative effects on the Hitler vote share. So in the 1930 election, for example, or 1932 election. But then it's going to flip to a pro-Hitler effect in the 1933 March election. And so that's a rather convincing demonstration, in my view, because the valence of the effect is going to switch. They also look at some other interesting outcomes, like joining the Nazi Party, anti-Jewish deportations before the final solution policy went into effect in 1942, on the grounds that most of the denunciations of people to the Gestapo were done on a kind of voluntary basis. Basically, individuals were denouncing Jews, and so it was kind of a latent manifestation of anti-Semitism. So I would say score that one for propaganda. Not an overwhelming effect. It's something in the order of 2, 3, 4 percentage points, but it's not nothing either. Another use of the same data by Barbara and Miller looks at an amazing data set, actually, of tens of thousands of records, basically biographical records of German soldiers. So these have been digitized and put in a database, and essentially tens of thousands of German soldiers had their war records and their place of where they grew up coded into the same map. And they claim to find that those who were in the catchment area of these transmitters were more likely to be decorated for valor, conversely less likely to be punished for insubordination and other kinds of things. It's not a super robust set of statistical findings, but perhaps suggests that propaganda motivated. Now let's flip on the other side of the ocean. Go to Father Coughlin, a new paper that's about to be published, I think, in the AER by Wang. Quite an interesting paper. It's a little easier for me to evaluate because it's in American politics. Now the map of the propagation zones are up there. This is one's in so-called free space, as if there were no topography to bounce around the signals of these transmitters, and the other is the predicted signal strength given topographical variation. What does Wang claim? Claims that exposure, as if random exposure as a result of variations in topography, leads to lower FDR vote share in 1936. So just to recount, Father Coughlin was a virulent anti-Semite. He started off being pro-FDR in 1932, but became disaffected by 1934. By 1936, he's supporting a third-party candidate and is, rabidly anti-FDR. And his broadcasts are incredibly popular. They are very widely listened to, especially among Catholics. So the thesis of the paper is that in the Catholic regions, since Wang, I guess, cuts out the South, in the Catholic regions of the upper Midwest, you find a sharp drop in FDR vote share, and he attributes that to signal. Now, there's an issue with the findings, or at least to my mind, and that is that he finds a diminution in FDR vote share in 1936, but he finds an even bigger one in 1940 and an even bigger one in 1944. But Father Coughlin was pushed off the air in 1940, and he never said another word on the air after that, because he was basically, it's a long story anyway. But he basically was in 1941. He was basically banned by war powers type acts, whereas before that he was just pushed off by internal regulation of radio programming. So at any rate, he never says another word, and yet the effects grow larger. That's a little bit weird. And then the effects are 0 under Truman, Mr. I support Israel. So it's a little bit odd that this sequence of events should progress the way it does, at least in my. I score that kind of as a maybe. I believe Merrill's phrase, which rings in my ears and has for many decades, is the phrase "interesting if true." So that actually is a good segue into the Gagliarducci paper, which uses a very similar design to look at different signal strength, but this time it's going to use variations in sunspots to separate the signal strength within relatively narrow geographic bands. And what they're going to do is look at Allied partisan activity behind German lines as a function of reception of BBC broadcasts during the kind of anti-fascist war in Italy from 43 to 45. And they find that there is an effect. Now, maybe that's a coordination effect, maybe it's a motivation effect. It's a little bit ambiguous. They also find no cumulative effect on the 1946 election, but it's a little hard to say what that amounts to, because even they say it's not really a natural experiment at that point, because so many waves of communication have gone by. So maybe we score that as a question mark. A very nice study, a study that is well worth reading, is this new study by Okayama, which looks at U.S. propaganda broadcasts after the occupation of Japan starting in 1945 and going to 1952. And what's interesting about this study is that the US instituted a new program on the only radio station that was left standing in 1945. There were essentially no newspapers because of a newspaper shortage. And the Allies in particular wanted to encourage women to vote now that they were newly enfranchised in the 1946 election. So they get right to work, and this Women's Hour program is really, really popular. It's kind of the only game in town, and women are listening to it at very high rates. And she maps out the propagation zones of signals and also matches them against subscription rates, because you had to pay to listen to radio. So what's kind of interesting about it is that she finds a considerable effect in terms of women's turnout in 1946. Not after that, but at least in 1946. So it's an interesting study. She also seems to find evidence that this program led to changes in fertility rates, which is the sign of things to come. Okay, fast forward a few decades to the Rwandan genocide of 1994. The Yanagazawa Drought paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics argues that RTLM, the Hutu radio station that encouraged the slaughter of the Tutsi in, I guess, from April to July of 1994, that places that could receive RTLM had much higher rates of killing, and had about 10% more genocidaire than they otherwise would have. Now, those are the propagation zones up there, and you can see that there are only two transmitters. And these are the genocidaire, prosecutions. You can see that on the Burundi border, there's a little bit of an anomaly here, because you've got some very high rates of killing in places that aren't really in the catchment areas of RTLM. You kind of go, let's see, this would be Tanzania. So Tanzania up to the Uganda border. You also see a lot of broadcasting there, but not a lot of killing. And you don't see a lot of killing here on the DRC border. I don't know. At any rate, I find that a little bit ambiguous. It's an interesting argument, and it applies statistically, but it doesn't necessarily involve what I guess would have in the old days been called an ocular regression test. Okay, so then we go to 1999, and in comes our informational autocrat, Vladimir Putin. Putin gets right to work in suppressing his opponents in NTV, but before he can, there's the 1999 election, and NTV is broadcast all over the country. And this study by Anna Kolopov and Petrova very nicely done study, is going to use the old Soviet set of transmitters that NTV occupied and look at different catchment areas, and they're going to find that it has a profound effect on in terms of diminishing Putin's vote share. Putin got right to work and imprisoned the oligarch who owned NTV, who slipped out of the country and then was forced to sell. And that was the end of NTV's influence on elections. 2007, basically the other informational autocrat of note, Chavez, suppresses two of the opposing television stations. One he puts out of business entirely. The other one he puts out of business partially. And Knight and Tribune used the partial ban or partial exclusion of one of the TV stations to identify the effects on Chavez voting, survey responses, and protest activity, and they find a relationship. So I'd say score that for independent voices. Those last two studies seem to suggest that breaking the monopoly on propaganda messaging makes a difference. One of the most interesting, probably the unique study in this list of studies is this cool study by Bleck and Mikulich. What's interesting about it is this is a field experiment. So they're going to randomly distribute radios in the middle of nowhere in Mali. Okay, they've got 10 villages that in 5 of them they distribute radios, in 5 of them they distributed solar powered flashlights. Okay, so now they've got their distributions going on, and out breaks a coup, and the junta takes control of the radio and tells people, I mean, the main message that they tell people is, we need to delay elections. No need to have elections right away. Let's wait. And then their other message is, of course, to support the junta as the true popular front. And what they find, interestingly, is that the treatment villages, the ones that received the radios, were more likely to believe that the election should be delayed. But interestingly, there was no extra level of support for the regime. So again, it suggests that the narrow message seems to sink in, the broader message, not so much. One more of these, a timely one, or at least the map should look sort of familiar to those of you who have been following the news. In 2014, Putin ramped up tremendously the number of broadcasts of TV messages about the impending Ukrainian election across the Ukrainian border. So these triangles are Russian transmitters. The red zones are the areas that had the largest saturation of Russian language, political discourse. And these authors, Pasekin and Rosenos, find a fairly substantial, not overwhelming effect, but 4% of the votes were, in their view, created by this onslaught of Russian television. All right, then my work is going to make a small cameo appearance here. And the reason it's going to make a small cameo appearance is that this is going to be a unique study in the list of studies, not because it's such a great study, but because it's unique in the sense that it is pre-planned, okay? So in 2018, we work with an NGO called Uzikwasa, and they have a radio station called Pangani FM. And that radio station is on the coast of Tanzania, right here, and its broadcast area is, it goes to about here and stops. But they've just got a new transmitter, and we're going to turn on the transmitter on a test basis for a couple days. We're going to send guys in motorcycles with radios through the Usambara Mountains, and they're going to tell us in which villages they're able to get the transmission, okay? So they're going to buzz around, they're going to report back, we're going to code it, great. Then we're going to turn off the transmitter, we're going to do a survey of people in the treatment areas and the control areas, and we're going to confirm that they have exactly the same views on the outcomes of interest. Now, the reason we're going to focus on particular outcomes having to do with gender equality, a la the study of Women's Hour in Japan, is that the focus of Uzikwasa is about broadcasting messages about gender equality in the home, in the workplace. They're against early and forced marriage. They're against sexual violence of all kinds. So that's going to be the program. It's going to be a talk radio as well as a kind of call-in show all the time. And so we do that. We turn on the transmitter, And we wait 13 months to go back, and we don't find very much of anything. Okay, so now I would say we're scoring propaganda maybe a little bit better than 50-50. It's maybe a little bit better, but now let's hear from survey experiments. So these survey experiments are going to be studies where you're going to have a whole bunch of survey respondents, and we're going to basically force them to watch point blank propaganda. And it's going to be real propaganda or placebo content. And for example, Mattingly et al., a very enterprising, very clever study, they're going to interview 6,000 plus people in 19 countries from every region of the globe, okay? And they're going to present them with hand-selected propaganda, actual propaganda communications from China and the United States. And for, I don't know, a drink or whatever, what is our propaganda agency called? The U.S. Agency of Global Media. Yes, U.S. Agency for Global Media. There we go. U.S. Yeah, it gets $800 million of taxpayer money a year. Your tax dollars at work. So at any rate, what they did was they had a 4-group design. The control group got nothing. So that's this group up there. Okay. And people are going to be asked, do you prefer, the kind of US way of doing the economy? Or do you prefer the Chinese way of doing the economy? Or what about the US way of doing politics, Chinese way of doing politics? Which would you prefer to have as a world leader? And you can see in the top row, the blue is bigger than the red. And so America is kind of in the lead before anybody hears anything. So that's the control group. Then they show the Chinese propaganda about, basically economic stewardship, how their economy is going strong, how they're able to, basically help the ordinary person with high employment rates. Their political model is all about technocracy and getting things done. And that seems to burnish their image in both counts. And they even seem a little bit more attractive as a world leader. So score 1 for propaganda, at least point blank propaganda. What about US propaganda? Well, it makes our blue lump bigger. We look better. We look better as a world leader. So people like our propaganda too. What happens though, and this is the kicker of the article, what happens when you show them both propaganda, ours propaganda and their propaganda? And the answer is, relatively speaking, the Chinese do better. Not a lot better necessarily as world leaders, but somewhat better. And so the framing of this paper it's slightly ludicrous, which is about our propaganda gap. Maybe we should be spending more. But the more pertinent question is, would this effect last? So would it last a week or 3 days or 3 months or whatever? Or do people return to their baseline as they go back to their usual milieu? Another interesting question that they do tackle this overtime question is whether the emotional reaction of propaganda is lasting and whether it spills over into general regime support. So in this study, they're going to focus on Chinese propaganda with Chinese respondents, okay? And they're going to show them either in the treatment group or the control group, a big dollop of propaganda or nothing at all. And they're going to find that, in this case, it's really bellicose propaganda of an anti-Japanese sort. So you're going to replay the depredations of the Japanese during World War II and get people all riled up about the Japanese, and they are riled up. So there's a big emotional reaction of an anti-Japanese sort among the Chinese respondents. They find that there's some residual resentment against the Japanese when they come back about a week later. But interestingly, no diffuse effects of a regime supporting sort on protest or general support. So it's kind of an interesting point. Again, they can get the narrow point of the communication, not necessarily the broad point. And then let's return to Hovland, Lumsden, and Sheffield, 1949. Because, reading this book again, it just really drives home what a genius Hovland was. I mean, he was so far ahead of his time. It's just astonishing. This is one of the very first randomized experiments in all social science. It was a book that was given to me actually because David Lumsden was Arthur Lumsden's son. And anyway, just that's how I ended up with the book. So I read it. And it's a very memorable book because it's basically a series of experiments with American soldiers in Europe trying to propagandize them to explain what the hell they're doing in France, because they don't know why they're in France. As far as they know, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, so we should be fighting the Japanese, right? And they don't necessarily want to be in France. They want to be wherever. And so what's kind of interesting is that these 7 films that they're going to be shown are going to explain, sort of step by step how we came to fight the Germans. So what's kind of interesting about it is they can get some factual information across, although not all that much, but they can't really get GIs to kind of support war aims or say that they'd really be happier fighting the Germans than they would be fighting the Japanese. There is one of the famous conclusions is this idea of a sleeper effect. So no effect immediately, but maybe an effect several weeks later. But actually reading this book, I realized why they could find something that is a little bit off, which is there are only 10 clusters here. There are just 10 military companies. So there's a lot more sampling variability than meets the eye, but that's a small technical point. Okay, so now there's a ton of literature that I have not summarized, and I'm coming up to my time. I apologize to those who sent it to me because I did read it. Let me just briefly summarize, what's left on the cutting room floor. So I haven't talked about the observational studies, like the new study by Josh Tucker and colleagues, basically arguing that Russian propaganda had very little effect on the attitudes of Twitter users, which is kind of an interesting new study. But there's also a vast and growing literature on the persuasive effects of media more generally, including narrative entertainment. So I'm doing a meta-analysis with my wonderful graduate student co-authors, and they're just magnificent. What we're finding is there is a robust effect of exposure to narrative entertainment on topics, ranging from gender-based violence to environmental conservation to you name it. And the effects do persist over time, but they are not massive, and they do not tend to change core attitudes, core orientations. So that's kind of an interesting twist. And that's also true for David and Josh's brilliant new study on exposure to CNN among regular Fox viewers. They're able to find changes in beliefs, find changes in attitudes and preferences, but not, core attitudes like partisanship. Okay, so now we come to the conclusion. So how do we square these two competing strands of the literature? If you show people propaganda point blank, you seem to produce an effect. But maybe it's kind of unclear as to whether that effect lasts. And sometimes you try your best and you march 10 US Army companies to the theaters, and it still doesn't really move them very much, at least not in terms of core attitudes. Well, one argument could be, well, the natural experiments that I showed you it's a problem of cherry picking. There's no pre-analysis planning, there's no real registration, people just do it. And, as far as I can tell, there isn't a single such published study, and beyond the ones that I've reported here, that doesn't find anything. So, maybe it's an issue of publication bias. But another issue is that maybe the natural experiments are more influential because the sheer dosage is so much greater. So that it could be that the treatment far exceeds what Uzi Quaso was capable of generating with one transmitter in northern Tanzania. So maybe the fact that the natural experiments tend to find significant but not overwhelmingly large effects is also plausible. That they're on the order of 4 or 5 percentage points. Not transformative, but not nothing either. So to conclude, does propaganda persuade? I would say yes. I was thinking of being cagey and saying, giving the apocryphal interview with Zhou Enlai in 1972, where he's asked, do you think the French Revolution was a success? To which he replied, "It's too soon to tell." But actually, it wasn't really like that. But anyway, it's a great story. But I thought, with respect to propaganda, it's interesting if you read the literature from the the kind of military intelligence folks, where they're trying to summarize this literature, they're saying it's impossible to tell. There's just not enough evidence to say clearly either whether it works or the conditions under which it works or for whom it works. So that's a kind of interesting commentary. But it does seem to be the case that when the dissenting voices are silenced, you do see an effect. I think I wouldn't call that a super robust conclusion, but it seems pretty compelling. I think that the effects tend to be fairly narrow. So you can rev up anti-Japanese sentiment, but it doesn't change your overall view about the Chinese regime. And I would say that operationally, maintaining high dosage confronts the problem that propaganda tends to be boring and predictable and audiences wane. So it's a little bit difficult to generate this kind of thing. Now, there's a counter literature I should point out, which says, actually, a lot of people in Russia, a lot of people in a lot of countries are exposed routinely to government propaganda because they're there for the sports programs or they're there for the entertainment programs. They just happen to bump into the propaganda sort of incidentally, and they know it's propaganda, but they listen to it anyway. And so the argument is, well, maybe the flip side is true, that even though it's boring and predictable, some people just have the damn TV on all day, and why not? But I would say that by and large, this is maybe the Achilles heel of propaganda, that it's the same and not very innovative. So then on balance, I would say the theories that say that informational autocrats are gradually taking over, that the old-fashioned ideologues who wanted to transform everybody in their society, who wanted to run roughshod over institutions, they're giving way to more, I don't know, more clever, long game type playing autocrats, and they actually get to die in office rather than being expelled. And so the issue is that for those people who are using a blend of propaganda and censorship, maybe this is a winning strategy. Maybe not an overwhelming strategy that can win against all odds, but it certainly does seem to disrupt their organized opposition and give them a chance to win. All right. There's my bibliography. I promised that it would be available. I'm also happy to share stuff. Jack, what would you like me to do here? Should I take questions? Let's take questions. Thank you.
We have a mic here, so we raise
Great.
your hands.
Hi, thanks for the comments. So I'm wondering if you've thought, so it seems like the natural experiments, the exposure is there, but you can't really measure uptake at all, just given the circumstances. In the survey experiments and maybe in other kinds of experiments, you get this small little signal that you can force them, they have to be exposed to as part of the experiment. So I'm wondering, what you want to do is you want to focus on uptake, and not only do they hear it, but do they listen to it? And so I'm wondering if there are clever ways to combine the advantages of the natural experiment, which is this repeated exposure, with the more pure experimental condition in which you can somehow force them, if you will, to be exposed to the thing, so that you to actually hear it as opposed to just be having it out there. And then that way you could get a nice, clean, causal inference.
It's a good question. It's an interesting question. Basically, it's the distinction between the so-called intent to treat effect and the complier average causal effect. So in the intent to treat effect, the propagandist is just trying to put it out there and hoping that it moves opinion. In the case of the complier average causal effect, they're saying, well, we want to get as many compliers, people who listen if and only if they're exposed or sent the message. But we're especially interested in having an effect on them. And we'd like to have as many as possible, but we want to know how big is the effect among them. That kind of compliance measurement is done in the case of the Chavez study, because they have surveys that are measuring what people are listening to. And it's also true in the case of the Father Coughlin studies, because there are surveys that establish that there are large numbers of people watching. But the purest of the placebo controls in the real world is not really possible, because you can't force people necessarily to watch. At most, you can just saturate their area. So I'd say that it's always going to be kind of closer to the intent to treat effect than it is the complier average causal effect.
I have a question, but before I ask my question, Don, I just want to say two things. One is it's such a pleasure to have you here. You are an inspiration to all of us and a hero as a social scientist. So thank you. Secondly, it was incredibly classy to use a lecture like this to give a broad view on an interesting question rather than a tour de force of your own work. So thank you for doing that as well. I guess I found this extremely interesting. I guess I have the reaction to it that I often have after looking at synthetic reviews of evidence, which is, and this is neither to fault the underlying evidence or your really incredibly interesting presentation of it, but the reaction is, well, yeah, I mean, the interpretation you gave seems plausible. Those are things that ex ante I might have thought seemed plausible, but I'm not really sure. And it's a little depressing for people who are like just starting their lives out in social science. Like, what is the answer for aggregation? Is it can't be just to do more experiments for the reasons you gave, that the treatment intensity is not maybe enough. And the natural experiments are interesting, but they're scattershot and they're all over the place. And I don't feel like I've walked away learning having learned something empirically from the synthesis. No fault to what but it's a question about social science that I would love to have your response to.
Well, it's a great question and a profound question. I guess that there are a few things that come to mind as you say it. One is, I think when you think about Lasswell in the 1930s worrying about propaganda, he's worrying about much larger effects than anything that I showed here, right? He's talking about the kinds of effects that are so large that you can see with the naked eye. And I think the largest one that we showed was something like an 8 or 9 percentage point effect. So what's kind of interesting about it is even at the high end of the distribution, the effects are not transformative. And although every one of these studies has a flaw, and although we might have guessed that the truth is somewhere in the range of the data that we saw, we can kind of say that the initial skeptics who heard about the need for counter propaganda and wondered, is that really an active issue? We're probably about right. Not because the effects were nothing, but the effects were not, as Jack would have said, big enough to drive a truck through. So that's one thing. But then the other thing, I guess, is these studies have a little bit of, they smack of the kind of retrospective storytelling sort. And I think that a review like this has gotten me to think, well, we really need to think prospectively about the next time we're going to do this, so that it's not after the fact. We can actually establish the quality of the comparisons ahead of the fact. So be a little bit more convinced by the natural experiments than we ultimately are. But I think that the broader point that you're getting at is a point that actually Hovland wrote about extensively, really wrestled with, which is, what are we going to do about experiments? If we can't assemble dosage sufficient to mimic the real world, what are we doing? And that's why maybe we need to kind of up our game a little bit, to either have especially persuasive messages to see the kind of decay pattern of their effects, or maybe we need to be studying people more or less in situ, because there are lots of times when there's friendly propaganda that we could be randomizing. I would say in that respect, while I wouldn't necessarily sign on to a kind of global experimental agenda on captured populations, the interesting thing about the American soldier studies of World War II is that they had the best and brightest of the social science elite, basically working with these military operations to do these experiments, because there was actually something that they really wanted to know. The military folks really wanted to know how they can buck up morale. And the question was, would propaganda films work? So maybe that last point is just, there actually was a practical concern that was astride the theoretical concern, and we could contribute that way. Great to see you. Thank you. I'll let you pick.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. This is very rich for me, and I'm grateful to have had this, as Thad said, sort of synthetic overview of a topic I'm also very interested in. And I wanted to push you a little on the sort of, maximum maybe 8% average effect, and think about at least 3 different kinds of heterogeneities that may be obscured by that, right? So one is in the receiver, some people are going to be more susceptible. And so if a small number of people are moved greatly, and in the context of something like an insurgency or, a call to violence, that could matter. Second kind of heterogeneity you've talked about, which I think is still worth wrestling, which is the doses could be 1,000x greater for somebody consuming a TV show, right? Like just, hundreds of hours of watching, The Apprentice or whatever it is. And then the third kind of heterogeneity is just in the quality of the content, right? Like my wife is a filmmaker, and some documentary films are like really good as information and do not move your heart at all. Right. And others, are like infomercials. They just grab your heartstrings and are like really affecting. And it's easy for me to imagine that like what makes propaganda is that the message is visible. It's like hitting you in the head with a 2x4. And like what makes it not propaganda is it's artistic, but that doesn't mean there's not doing a lot of work to convey a political message.
Let me take in reverse order. I'm very sympathetic to the complaint that the study of propaganda is really ad hoc. In fact, the study of persuasive communication in the mass media is ad hoc. And I think that it's a topic too important to be ad hoc. We should really get serious about studying variations in storyline, in messengers, all the kinds of things that go into the production values and so on and so forth, the length. Repetition, whether it's serialized, you name it. And in this mode, I mean, I've been working on a grant proposal with BBC Media Action, where we're trying to do this. We're going to try to get a big group of writers to write a wide array of different narratives and basically produce them, kind of first cut type things, present them to subjects in a lab setting, and then have a tournament, and then graduate to a lab in the field setting, and then have a tournament and go to a field experimental setting. We'll see. I mean, it obviously requires resources, but more importantly, it requires a completely different, mode of thought, because even the media that is supposedly effective, for example, in reducing gender-based violence, I mean, it's never reproduced. It's not like Shakespeare where you go do it again. It's in an archive. And so my hope is that we can take the things out of the archive and we can reproduce them and test them systematically going forward. Then going back to your first point, the idea would be, let's do a systematic study of basically the unfinished business of Hovland. Like, which people were the most susceptible? Hovland's theory actually was, when it comes to political propaganda, it's not the people with low levels of education who are the most susceptible. It's the people with high education levels, because they were the ones who were able to get the broader point. And I think that's a very interesting proposition with respect to social issues like climate change or gender-based violence, and the list goes on and on. And it might be different kinds of people for different kinds of messages. And that's some of our early work using placebo-controlled designs suggests that that's true, that there isn't a very strong correlation between whether you're moved on one, whether you're moved on another. Peter. No, go ahead. I didn't see you had the microphone, please.
Okay. So thank you for this super interesting talk. I don't know if people realize you also have an overview of edutainment, which strikes me as sort of the positive version of this for Thad's question, but very similar, except that maybe the literature is less well done there, but it's sort of the positive version of propaganda and seems to find similar patterns. And so you, I think, called it narrow versus broad persuasion, and you brought up Bandura. And I would sort of ask, like, should we expect this to work? Should we expect these kinds of treatments to work on deep social norms? Like, should those be easy to move? Because it would seem from a psych perspective, like maybe they shouldn't. Like all these like small effects are the best you're going to get because our norms shouldn't be susceptible to nudges. And so on the one hand, like I believe the findings, but maybe like we're dealing with a sort of structural / psychological problem, which is the objects of our study who are consenting adults are too old to be moved by the mechanism that someone like Bandura would suggest.
It's a really interesting point. There's so much to say about it. I would say one of the terms that I learned in Jack's class way back in 1983 was this idea from Fishbein and Asian called conative attitudes. So conative attitudes were attitudes about action. Would I be willing to help a victim of intimate partner violence if I heard screams and cries? Okay, so in one of the films that we tested using a placebo-controlled design, the message was clearly about modeling that behavior, reporting that these allegations are credible. If you have a report, they will be taken seriously. And so we were completely unable to change attitudes about the propriety of gender-based violence. We could not change the view about whether a husband has a legitimate right to beat his wife if she disobeys, but we could really move people in terms of whether they would be willing to report such things. And so what's kind of interesting from the standpoint of a propagandist is maybe they want to just motivate you to fight Germans in France, and that's it. They'll if they can do that, that's fine. Whereas other, aspirations have to do with, your deep understanding of the purpose of the war and things like that, which may be harder to move, both intellectually and in terms of attitudes. So I think the core attitudes are hard to move. I've never really moved them successfully. That's why I'm a little bit suspicious of other findings that seem to show the opposite. But I'm in agreement with your basic point. Peter.
So I have a Hovland related question before I do. This audience, there's an amazing talk, but this audience is obviously deeply respectful of your scholarship and your mentorship. But what people don't know is I have never beaten Don at ping pong. He has crushed me every time for the last several years. So you should put his ping pong skills at least equal to his scholarship. But I do have a Hovland question. So it seems like Farage kind of took a page from Hovland's book about the World War II propaganda to convince the British that Brexit was a good thing, this kind of concerted, ongoing, kind of these messages that built on each other, like trying to teach the American soldiers that, that fighting the Germans was a good thing. And now most Britons feel they were duped. The vast majority of Britons actually are unhappy with Brexit. So my question is, has anyone run any experiments or done anything? Because this seemed like the dosage was extremely high. It was sort of a binary event with a single point in time, yep. And that it succeeded because the propaganda actually did drown out the more countervailing rational argument.
And it was a very, very close election. The best paper on this is by Florian Foos, F-O-O-S, on the Sun in England. It appears in the American Political Science Review. It basically makes the point that for some completely unrelated reason having to do with a soccer tragedy, the Sun was essentially effectively not distributed in a particular region of England, and therefore they did not absorb the Euroscepticism of that newspaper, and their voting rates were completely different on that issue. And it's a nice illustration of that effect. By the way, when I was way back in 1983, 84, there was a similar kind of argument about the Manchester Union leader, right? That was also floating around, and Eric Veblen. And so this idea, this design goes way back, but the Foes paper is really a beauty.
Thank you.
Sure.
And will you ever let me beat you at ping pong?
You're already on the way to kicking my rear end. How much longer I can last, I don't know.
I'd like to add, don't jog with John, because that's an equally embarrassing experience. It's a good jogger.
I'm glad that I'm collecting all this information now. Lovely to see you, Don. One of
see
the
you.
questions that I had was related to how important this work is. And one of the most important case studies I could imagine of this work is exploring the effects of fascist propaganda or propaganda in which you're trying to motivate individuals to be violent towards another group or discriminate against another group openly. And when I was thinking about that, I was wondering if you found any literature on whether network effects exacerbate or attenuate anti-group propaganda. And so what that means is either is propaganda more or less effective when you are from a place with a large number of individuals in the outgroup we're trying to get rid of? Or does it depend on how many close ties you have to that group? Because I could imagine different, I suppose, fascist motivations. Either you're targeting folks who don't have exposure to this outgroup because you think they'll let it slide, they don't know any better, and you need their permissiveness to get your agenda through. Or you're trying to rile up conflict in areas where you have a lot of outgroup, in-group communication. And I didn't see that in your literature review, but I'm wondering if there's been any work on it because it seems important.
It is important, and I think it's a largely overlooked nuance. But I was earlier urging you to take a look at the survey evidence of the Father Coughlin era, and that would be the perfect way to get at this. Why? Because those surveys have Catholics living in areas that are either densely Catholic or not so densely Catholic. And the question is Coughlin's effect larger or smaller in areas where there's a kind of critical mass of Catholics? Maybe larger because they can talk each other into a kind of anti-Semitic frenzy, anti-FDR frenzy, or smaller because they are also going to be susceptible to countervailing messages from others in their social milieu, including their own religious leaders.
Or whether Coughlin's message is more or less effective where there are more or less Jewish individials, right? In an area?
Yeah,
Might not be
well,
hard to.
Yeah, I think that I forget who the wag was who said that anti-Semitism has nothing to do with Jews. Basically the irony of that map is that it's happening where there are effectively no Jews.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
David's got a good point, and so does Meryl. These are royalty in my view.
Thanks so much, Don, for this great talk. So there were a few different themes that you briefly alluded to, and I just since you've done this since just prodigious amount of reading over the last few weeks on this, I'm curious if you have anything more to say about them. So one is on the I think it was the very beginning. You don't need to go back, but you mentioned this idea that part of what propaganda could do is essentially reduce trust in mainstream media. And that's an idea I've kind of been interested in for a while, going back when I was at Stanford and I did one of these MBA junkets to Greece. And this is a message we heard a lot there is why is there so much corruption in Greece? That many people on the ground said to us something like, well, paper A says there is corruption, paper B says there isn't corruption, we don't know what to do. And so I'm curious if there's anything in the literature to that notion that essentially if you're in a context where you can't censor, what you want to do then is just kind of throw out a bunch of junk so that people say, the media, all inconsistent, I don't know what to believe, and you just don't listen to it. And then briefly, you also mentioned, so there's this coordination idea, which I think is kind of the flip side of what Pia was getting to that I know some economists especially are interested in. And then last, just the idea of source, you kind of really focused on kind of state propaganda through official propaganda. But as we broaden our focus, like you said, to media, we're thinking about the David Yang AER paper, the New York Times, or the Latin Lens paper. I'm curious kind of how you see this in conversation with propaganda that's not state propaganda necessarily, but kind of people, free media sources working from a certain ideological side or set of conceptions.
Well, there's so much richness in these questions that I can't do anything but just kind of scratch the surface. But I think that the source credibility point was a big point for Coughlin, and that's why much of his career was focused on source credibility. I think that what's kind of interesting about this is, and this comes out in a lot of the works on China, that the Chinese have sufficiently They've sort of succeeded at besmirching the reliability of outside media, so much so that even, as you know, from the AER paper, even when Chinese are given an opportunity to jump the Great Firewall, they don't really do it because they don't think that there's going to be anything there for them to find interesting or trustworthy. So in a way, that's like the epitome of an informational autocrat victory. When you cast aspersions on either the motives or the believability of alternative sources. How that comes to be is a little bit mysterious. That particular paper is about students at the most elite university in China. And I wonder whether this is something that an elite person would have heard many times from the educational system up to that point, or whether this is something that every Chinese person gets. And so that's why it's kind of interesting to ask who jumps the firewall if given the opportunity. I can go on and on about the literature here. What's interesting is that the equivalent literature on jumping the firewall in Iraq and maybe Russia does not find the same kind of thirst for forbidden content that you see among Chinese who jump the firewall. So it's kind of an interesting commentary that one of the ways that informational autocrats might win is by lowering demand. The coordination thing, I think that's completely unexplored. Yana Ghazala tries to get at this in his paper by differentiating between two kinds of genocide, one collective by individuals and the other organized by established groups. And he finds that RTLM affects both, which is kind of interesting. But other papers just don't make an attempt to differentiate. So I think it's a really open and unsolved question.
I wanted to touch again on the issue of playing the long game, and also how wide the world of evidence that you're interested, rather than just looking at state or party or religion. How about industrial sector? That I wanted to mention that over the last 2 or 3 congressional cycles, you notice how everyone on all sides of the political spectrum have stopped using the term fossil fuel and have started using the term energy, as though that was natural and not just a deliberate effort on the part of fossil fuel companies to change the language that we're using so that we now use the term energy when we mean fossil fuel. And that the Exxon and Mobil's own examinations, as well as New York Times examinations, shows that 2 decades of every Thursday full-page advertorial ads in the New York Times succeeded in changing the New York Times's editorial stance on 7 or 8 key issues that are in Exxon's interests. And then another one I would point to is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. That over time, Mothers Against Drunk Driving has had kind of, I think, a clear and measurable effect on stigmatizing drunk driving. And then also removing advertising from television and radio for cigarettes clearly had a strong effect on onset and prevalence of smoking. So that rather than just thinking about political sources or party sources of advertising, what about industrial sector sources of propaganda? Mm-hmm. And the evidence there, I think, is very strong.
Interesting. And I hadn't thought about that, but it's certainly a cognate literature that would be interesting. Now, it's hard to get a kind of systematic bead on it. And that's what has frustrated me about the kind of, I don't know, it's kind of like the political / economic communication research literature. It's, for example, the move from illegal alien to undocumented person. I mean, it's said to have an effect, but I haven't seen much by way of systematic investigation, although it would be very interesting to do. But your point is taken that the investigation of persuasive communication with the idea of furthering an interest could be much broader than what I've done.
Thanks, Don. Really great talk. Have there been any studies on children and the effect of propaganda on children? Because I just feel like their minds are more malleable, and what we know from.
There is a kind of narrative and entertainment literature on children. The closest thing that would approximate like this line of research would be the cohort effect studies, for example, purporting to show, I think it's a 2014 paper by an I'll think of the name, 2014 paper that in PNAS that shows that children who came of age in Germany during the Nazi period were much more anti-Jewish in their attitudes than those who came after or before. And so the argument is there could be kind of the residue of pre-adult socialization in their attitudes. But I think that this is one of those understudied topics. And in effect, it sort of reflects, unfortunately, the lack of scholarly focus on socialization. But basically all the countries that have had these kinds of interregnum periods would be susceptible to this kind of analysis. There are also people who dispute this. So I think Ron Rogowski in his Rational Legitimacy book says actually the most interesting thing about German public opinion is how little residue there is among adults, for example, from the Nazi period. It's a great question. Great to see you.
One last.
Meryl's got his hand up.
Well, from your first screen, I had a question sort of stored here. It has to do with American stories about what is sometimes called propaganda. And the question is really, are there any known to be spectacular success stories? One of them was on that screen, buy war bonds.
Yes.
What do people say about the effectiveness of that very large, high dosage, super intensive, persistent campaign?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really know the war bonds literature very well, in part maybe because it doesn't fit into this radio topography type research paradigm. But it would be damn interesting just to look at that.
Hard to
because
study for that
it'd be
reason.
hard to study. But there's no doubt that you see a shift, but this is the problem. Is it reality or is it advertising that is driving it? It occurs to me that one could look at surges in advertising and see whether that precipitated a surge in war bonds buying. It actually occurred to me now that we just talked about corporate interventions. One of the things that we do think that I think is a relatively established fact is that when state lotteries cease to advertise, ticket buying sags. So that would be consistent in some ways with this war bond idea that we need to continually buck it up. Thanks. Great. And great to see you, of course.
Thanks for the talk.
So Don, I'm going to give you a final example of failed propaganda. Every year, Bob Price and I get called by the people trying to sell us football tickets. And every year they tell us we're going to be really good. And every year we know that's false, but every year we buy our tickets anyway. So, there you go.
It has a motivational effect.
Yeah. Let me do the final act here.
While you're coming to the front, I'm going to tell a quick Jack Citrin story, okay?
Okay.
All right. So a quick, I have a bunch, but I think no, won't embarrass. So Jack in 1984, the spring of 84, asked me to be an RA on a paper that we're writing about the tax revolt in California, basically the sequel to the Something for Nothing book. And it's a short paper. And so Jack says, look, you've already written the draft and I've already written the other parts of it. You've done survey work. We're putting it together. You said word perfect. And now we're going to edit it. We're going to come and we're going to put the thing together. We're going to edit it. And so come to my office at 9 o'clock and we'll get started. All right. So I show up at 9 o'clock and Jack says, we're going to start with the first sentence. We're going to work on every word. We're going to make it clear. We're going to choose every word carefully. And 20 minutes later, we emerged with the first sentence. And then we went to the second sentence, 20 minutes. And I realized I may not live long enough to do this paper. But the main thing that I took away was that up until that moment, it never occurred to me that you would write a paper for anything other than an A. Like the only reason you write a paper is to turn it in and move on to the next paper. And I realized at that moment, as Jack would put it, it's all about your contribution. What contribution are you making? And this is a turning point in my career. Up until that point, it was never about your contribution. It was only about the damn assignment. And that was having the bigger picture was so critical. So I'm very grateful to Jack.
Well, that's a great story, Don. And I want to conclude by saying just a couple of words. I mean, the first thing is that it is true that we met 40 years ago. And to steal a line from Casablanca, that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship from which I benefited tremendously in many respects. Many of the things he said, I said in that seminar, you just have to take on faith because I have no recollection. of saying that at all, but probably I did kind of say at least some of them. But anyway,
I have more.
oh, no. I do want to say that among our joint activities was winning the first, and I think only political science graduate student and faculty tennis tournament. And then Don played shortstop on our summer league softball team. Tom here was on that team. And the highlight of that was when we brought in enough young athletes to beat the campus police. So that was really because they were big and strong. But anyway, you know, we collaborated on about 8 or 9 papers. That was in an earlier era of research for Don. It was before he made this jump, which all of us have benefited from, to pioneering experimental research and field experiments. But I'm really relieved, Don, that at no point did you suggest taking your name off those papers, you know, because they fall short of contemporary standards, I suppose, in some ways. But anyway, it's been great to have you here. And I know people want to mingle with you and have some wine and so forth. I'm going to 2 last things. First of all, David, thanks so much for helping organize this and for your ongoing involvement in the center. And I want to thank the 2 undergraduate assistants we have, Ishan and Gracial, who are outside, and of course, Eva Sito, who basically runs the administration of the center, and Serena in the Department of Political Science. Really an honor for me to have something named after me while I'm still alive, which is, you can enjoy it more that way. Finally, here is a physical award for you. And let me just read it. It says, Donald, I gotta look at the side, right? Donald P. Green, 2022 Award for Achievements in Public Opinion Research.
Thank you so much, Jack.
Beautiful. And I think, let me just say one last thing. People sometimes come up to me, maybe to you too, Marilyn, and say, oh, you were Don Green's teacher. And I really like that, unless they said, you were Don Green's teacher. But when he left here, I'll have to say, Marilyn, I think we'll agree on this. We had no inkling that, 10 or 15 years later, whenever it was, he would launch this new revolution in political science. So that's all totally self-taught.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.